William woke to the sound of his daughter coughing. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against the shutters of their cottage, and for a moment he lay still, listening to Sarah's wet, rattling breaths from the corner where Emma rocked her. 3 months old and already fighting her second chest cold. The spring had been cruel this year, rain turning the roads to rivers and seeping through thatch that needed replacing. Replacing cost money they didn't have. Everything cost money they didn't have. He pushed himself upright, joints protesting. 32 years old and his body already felt ancient. The price of farming 10 acres with tools that broke more often than they worked, and a plow horse that was older than his marriage. He pulled on his tunic, the fabric stiff with dried sweat in yesterday's dirt, and moved toward the door. Emma glanced up, her face drawn with exhaustion, and he touched her shoulder as he passed. No words. They'd stopped wasting words on things that couldn't be changed. Outside, the May air carried the smell of wet earth and manure. Dawn was breaking over Yorkshire in shades of gray and pale gold, illuminating fields that should have been fully planted by now, but weren't. William had lost 4 days to the spring fever that had swept through the village, and those 4 days meant 4 days of planting not done, which meant less grain come harvest, which meant his family would eat less next winter. The mathematics of peasant survival were simple and unforgiving. John emerged from the cottage, rubbing sleep from his eyes. 8 years old, tall for his age, with Emma's dark hair and William's broad shoulders already starting to show. The boy who should have been playing was instead reaching for the seed bag without being told. William watched his son hoist the leather sack and felt something twist in his chest. Children in Yorkshire didn't stay children long. They couldn't afford to. They worked in silence as the sun climbed, William breaking soil with the wooden plow, while John followed behind, dropping seeds into furrows with hands that were developing calluses. Mary appeared an hour later, 5 years old and supposed to be watching Sarah, but Emma had sent her out with a water skin and bread. The bread was 3 days old and hard enough to break teeth, but William chewed it without complaint. Complaining accomplished nothing. By mid-morning, the temperature had risen, and William's shirt clung to his back. The plow blade kept catching on rocks that the winter frost had pushed to the surface, jarring his arms, making the half-healed cut on his left hand reopen. He wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from his already tattered hem and kept working. There was no time for rest. The planting season was a narrow window, and every day wasted was a step closer to starvation. He was thinking about the northern field, calculating how many days until he could start on it, when he heard the horses. 3 riders coming up the road from the village. William straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt before stopping. Running would accomplish nothing. Resisting would accomplish less. He knew what this was before they even reached his field. The lead rider wore the Lord's colors, a surcoat that had probably been fine once but was now faded and patched. His face was weathered, lined with the permanent scowl of a man whose job was delivering bad news. The bailiff. William had seen him twice before, both times collecting taxes that hurt. The 2 men behind him were younger, armed with swords that looked better maintained than anything William owned. The bailiff didn't dismount. He pulled a scroll from his belt, unrolled it with the practiced motion of a man who'd done this too many times, and began reading without preamble. His voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting words that meant nothing to him, personally, but everything to the people hearing them. King Edward required men for the war in France. Every able-bodied man between 16 and 45 owed service to his lord. The lord owed service to the king. The chain of obligation was absolute. Each household would provide 1 man. Those who failed to report would be considered deserters. The penalty for desertion was death and confiscation of property. William barely heard the specifics. The words blurred together into a single message he'd been dreading since rumors of war had started circulating last autumn. France. Months of marching, battles where common men died by the thousands while nobles collected ransoms. If you were lucky, you came home missing pieces. If you weren't, you didn't come home at all. The bailiff finished reading and looked at William with eyes that held neither sympathy nor malice, only administrative efficiency. 1 man from this household. Report to the assembly point in 3 days. Bring whatever weapon you possess. Failure to appear would result in immediate seizure of land and arrest of family members who would be sold to cover the debt. William opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His mind was racing through calculations that all ended in the same place. 3 days. The planting half finished. Emma alone with 3 children, one still nursing. No money saved. No family close enough to help except Emma's brother, and he barely managed his own household. If William didn't report, they'd lose everything. If he did report, they'd lose him, which might amount to the same thing. The bailiff was already turning his horse when John stepped forward. The boy's voice was high and uncertain but clear. Could he go instead of his father? He was almost 9, nearly a man, and his father needed to finish the planting, or the family would starve. William's blood turned to ice. He grabbed John's shoulder, gripping hard enough to make the boy wince, pulling him back. The words came out harsh, sharper than he intended. John was a child. This wasn't his burden. Get back to the house now. But the bailiff had stopped. He turned in his saddle, looking at John with the appraising gaze of someone evaluating livestock. The boy was tall, strong enough to carry a spear maybe, and the Lord needed bodies to meet his quota. The bailiff's expression shifted into something that might have been consideration. William felt the world narrow to a single point. This moment, this choice, he saw with absolute clarity what was about to happen. The bailiff would take John. The law said able-bodied males 16 and up. But in times of desperate need, 16 became flexible. He'd heard stories from the last campaign. Boys as young as 12 pressed into service, most of them dead before their first real battle. The words left William's mouth before conscious thought. He would go. He was volunteering. No need to take the boy. William was strong, experienced with tools that could become weapons, and he'd report on time with no resistance. Just leave his son out of this. The bailiff studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, made a mark on his scroll next to William's name, and repeated the instructions. 3 days. Assembly point at the crossroads. Do not be late. The horses turned and rode toward the next farm. William stood frozen, watching them disappear down the road, his hand still gripping John's shoulder. The boy was shaking, or maybe William was shaking. It was hard to tell. John's voice was small, confused. Why did you do that? I could have gone. You're needed here more than me. William wanted to explain, but the words tangled in his throat. How do you tell your 8-year-old son that you'd just chosen to possibly die to keep him from definitely dying? That war consumed children even faster than it consumed men? That whatever hell waited in France was something no father could willingly send his child toward? Instead, he said something about duty and obligation, words that sounded hollow even to himself. Then he sent John back to the cottage and stood alone in the half-planted field, staring at furrows that would probably never be finished. Emma knew before he said anything. She saw his face as he entered, and her expression went carefully blank, the way it did when she was bracing for pain. Sarah was sleeping finally, bundled in cloths that needed washing, but wouldn't get washed because there wasn't enough firewood to heat water, and everything required choices about what necessity to sacrifice, William told her. The words came out mechanical, stripped of emotion because letting emotion in would break something fundamental. 1 man per household. He'd volunteered to stop them taking John. 3 days to report. The war in France. Length of service unknown. Emma listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a long time, staring at the cold fireplace. Then she asked the only question that mattered. What would happen to them while he was gone? William had been asking himself the same question for the past hour and had no good answer. Emma's brother might take them in. The village would help, perhaps. Though the village was losing men too, and charity was a limited resource. The planting would have to be finished somehow. The harvest, if there was a harvest, would need to be brought in. Taxes would still be owed. Sarah needed medicine they couldn't afford even with William working. His wife's voice cut through his sprilling thoughts. We'll manage. Her tone was flat, factual, the voice she used for things that weren't actually manageable, but had to be faced anyway. You're coming back. You have to come back. We need you, William wanted to promise. The words were right there, but promising something you had no control over felt like lying, and he'd never lied to Emma. So instead, he held her while she didn't cry, because crying was a luxury neither of them could afford. and felt the weight of what he'd just committed to settling into his bones. The next 3 days passed in a blur of desperate preparation. William worked from before dawn until after dark, trying to finish as much planting as possible. Emma's brother came and promised to help with the harvest, though his expression suggested he knew it was an empty promise. You couldn't harvest what you hadn't planted. The mathematics were unforgiving. William's weapon was a billhook, the curved blade he used for cutting brush and trimming trees. He spent an evening sharpening it on the whetstone until the edge could split hairs, trying not to think about what that edge might be used for. The blade was designed for wood. Flesh was softer than wood, easier to cut. The thought made him nauseous. He had no armor. Armor cost more than his land was worth. Emma fashioned a kind of padded jacket from old blankets, stitching layers of wool together with thread she'd been saving for mending clothes. It was crude, lumpy, and would probably provide as much protection as wearing extra shirts. But it was something. In a world where you had nothing, something mattered. The night before he left, William tried to write a letter. He learned his letters from the village priest years ago, enough to scratch out his name and a few simple words, but complex thoughts escaped him. He sat with ink and parchment that Emma's brother had provided, trying to compose something his family could keep if he didn't return. The words wouldn't come. What did you say? How did you pack a lifetime of love and regret in desperate hope into sentences that barely captured the surface? Finally, he gave up on writing and simply held Emma in the darkness. Her body was familiar, every curve and angle memorized over 9 years of marriage. He tried to memorize it deeper, imprint it in whatever part of the mind held things that couldn't be lost. She whispered against his shoulder, "Come back, just come back. I don't care how, just come back." He wanted to promise again. The words still wouldn't come. Mary gave him a flower she'd picked from the garden, the kind of gift only a 5-year-old would think meaningful. William put it carefully in his pack where it would die within days, but he couldn't tell her that. John gave him a smooth river stone, something to remember home by. Sarah, who understood nothing, grabbed his finger and smiled, and that smile nearly undid him completely. The walk to the assembly point took 2 hours. William left before dawn, walking through a landscape he'd known his entire life, seeing it differently now. Every field, every tree, every bend in the road might be the last time. He tried to memorize it all and knew memory wasn't enough. Other men were walking the same road. Farmers like him, some older, some younger, all wearing expressions ranging from resignation to poorly concealed terror. No one spoke. What was there to say? They were all caught in the same trap, all doing the same mathematics about families left behind and chances of return. The assembly point was chaos. Hundreds of men milling around in a muddy field, more arriving every few minutes. There was no organization, no clear indication of where to go or what to do. Someone had erected a tent where men were supposed to register, but the line stretched forever and moved at the pace of bureaucracy, which was to say, barely at all. William found a relatively dry spot and waited. A man near him was vomiting from nerves. Another was crying quietly, face turned away so no one would see. A third was drinking from a flask with the dedicated focus of someone trying to achieve unconsciousness before duty required consciousness. He recognized Thomas from the next village over. They'd met a few times at market, exchanged pleasantries about weather and crops. Thomas was younger, maybe 25, unmarried and still living with his parents. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he gripped a rusty spear that looked older than both of them combined. Thomas moved closer, needing someone to talk to, needing the shared misery of company. His voice shook. Did William know anything about the war? About where they were going? How long they'd be gone? William knew only rumors. France. The king wanted France or parts of France or something to do with France. The specifics didn't matter to men like them. Geography was irrelevant when you had no choice about traveling there. Length of service was supposedly until the campaign ended, which could mean months or years. No one knew. Or if they knew, they weren't telling. More men arrived throughout the morning. The sun climbed and the temperature rose, and the smell of hundreds of unwashed bodies packed together became overwhelming. There was no food provided, no water except what men had brought themselves. William drank sparingly from his water skin, unsure when he'd be able to refill it. Around midday, someone important arrived. A knight on horseback, wearing actual armor that gleamed in the sunlight, accompanied by several mounted men-at-arms. The murmuring crowd fell silent as he rode to the center of the field. His voice carried, trained for giving orders across the noise of battle, each word clear and sharp. They were now part of King Edward's army. They would march to the coast, then to France. They would fight for their king and their country and God. Those who served bravely would be rewarded. Those who deserted would be hunted down and hanged. The rules were simple and absolute. The speech lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then the knight rode away and sergeants began shouting orders, dividing the mass of men into companies with no apparent logic. William ended up in a group of about 200, most of them strangers, commanded by a sergeant whose first act was to make clear he had no interest in learning their names, because most of them would be dead soon anyway. The sergeant was older, maybe 40, with a face that looked like it had been broken and badly set multiple times. He was missing the pinky and ring finger on his left hand, the stumps healed but still angry red. His voice was hoarse from years of shouting and probably drinking. His eyes held the flat, dead gaze of someone who'd seen too much and felt too little. He walked down the line of men, evaluating them the way a butcher evaluates cattle. Most received only a glance of contempt. A few got nods of grudging approval. When he reached William, he stopped. His eyes fixed on the billhook at William's belt, then moved to William's hands, calloused and scarred from farm work. Strong hands. Hands that knew how to hold a blade. The sergeant's voice was rough. "What's your name?" William answered. The sergeant studied him for another moment, then moved on without comment. But William noticed the tiny mark the sergeant made on his list, some notation that probably meant nothing good. The sergeant reached Thomas and stopped again, but this time his expression was different. Thomas was thin, too thin, with the look of someone who'd been sick recently and hadn't fully recovered. The spear in his hands wavered from the weight. The sergeant reached out and grabbed the weapon, testing Thomas's grip. Thomas held on, but barely. The sergeant's laugh was harsh. "You'll be dead in a week, front rank probably. Nothing personal, just facts." Thomas's face went from pale to gray. The sergeant handed back the spear and moved on, leaving Thomas standing there with tears starting to form that he desperately tried to blink away. They spent the rest of the day learning to march in formation, which mostly involved walking in semi-straight lines while sergeants screamed about spacing and keeping step. It was harder than it looked. Hundreds of men trying to move together turned into a stumbling mob within minutes. The sergeant screamed more. Men tripped over each other. Someone fell and was trampled. Not seriously, but enough to provoke more screaming from the sergeants about paying attention. By evening, William's feet hurt, and they hadn't even begun the real march yet. They were given their first rations, a chunk of bread that was mostly sawdust and some ale that tasted like someone had strained it through dirty clothes. The bread was hard enough to require soaking in the ale to become chewable. This was apparently what army food was like. William's stomach, already knotted with anxiety, rebelled against the combination. That night they slept in the open field. No tents for common soldiers. William had brought a thin blanket that provided almost no warmth. The May night was cold, and the ground was hard, and sleep was impossible anyway, because his mind wouldn't stop spinning through everything he'd left behind. Thomas ended up near him in the darkness. The younger man was shaking, though whether from cold or fear was unclear. Probably both. Thomas's voice was a whisper. "I don't think I can do this. I don't think I'm strong enough." William wanted to offer reassurance but couldn't think of any that wasn't a lie. So instead, he offered the truth. None of them were strong enough. That's not why they were here. They were here because refusing meant worse things than dying in France. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, his voice even smaller. "My mother cried when I left, begged me to run away. But where would I run? They'd find me. They'd take the farm. She'd starve." William understood. Every man here had a version of the same story. Families held hostage by the feudal system's brutal mathematics. You went to war or your family suffered. Simple, inevitable, inescapable. The days that followed blurred into a routine of misery. Wake before dawn, eat terrible food, march in circles pretending to be a military formation. Eat more terrible food, sleep on the ground. Repeat. The training was minimal and mostly consisted of sergeants screaming about keeping your spear pointed forward and not running away when the enemy charged. Actual tactics were apparently too complex for peasants. William tried to learn what he could. How to hold the billhook properly for fighting instead of farming. How to stay in formation when everyone around you was panicking. How to identify the banners and horns that meant advance or retreat. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something was better than nothing. On the fourth day, more men arrived. The army was growing, companies coming from different regions, converging into something larger and more terrifying. With the new arrivals came camp followers, women mostly, though some men and children too. They set up on the edges of the main camp, offering services ranging from laundry to companionship to spiritual comfort. A priest appeared, an old man with kind eyes who moved among the soldiers, offering confession and absolution. William found himself in line without consciously deciding to go. When his turn came, he knelt in the mud and tried to think of sins worth confessing. His mind kept circling back to the same thing. He'd volunteered for this. He'd chosen to leave Emma and the children. Was that a sin? Choosing possible death over certain death for his son? The priest listened to his rambling confession without judgment. When William finished, the old man's voice was gentle. You chose love over fear. That's never a sin. Whatever happens in France, carry that with you. You made the choice a father makes. God sees that. The absolution should have provided comfort. It didn't. William walked away feeling the same hollow weight in his chest, the same certainty that he'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. On the seventh day, the order came to march. They were moving out, heading for the coast. The real journey was beginning. William shouldered his pack, gripped his billhook, and fell into line with the rest of his company. Thomas was somewhere behind him. The sergeant was ahead, still making marks on his list, still counting which men would survive and which wouldn't. The column stretched for miles. Thousands of men, horses, wagons, camp followers, all moving together like some massive, wounded animal crawling across the landscape. The pace was slow, dictated by the slowest elements. The wagons kept getting stuck in mud. Horses went lame. Men fell out of formation to vomit or shit and had to run to catch up. By the end of the first day, William's feet were blistering. The boots he'd worn to the assembly point were falling apart, the stitching coming loose, the soles separating from the uppers. He tried to repair them that night using strips torn from his blanket, but the fix was temporary and he knew it. Within a week, he'd probably be walking barefoot. Thomas collapsed during the second day's march, just stopped walking and sat down in the road, his face gray, his breathing labored. William grabbed his arm and hauled him upright, supporting part of his weight, keeping him moving because stopping meant being left behind. The sergeant noticed but said nothing, just made another mark on his list. Thomas would be dead within the week. Everyone knew it. Thomas knew it. That night, William woke to the sound of retching. Thomas was on his hands and knees, vomiting dark liquid that looked more like blood than food. Dysentery. The word passed through the camp in whispers. The disease that killed more soldiers than battle ever did. Once it started, it spread like fire through dry grass. By the third day, at least 20 men in their company were showing symptoms. The sergeants responded by speeding up the march, trying to outpace the disease, which made no sense but at least gave the illusion of action. Men who couldn't keep up were left by the roadside with promises that wagons would collect them. Everyone knew the wagons wouldn't come. William watched Thomas decline with grim inevitability. The younger man was lighter each day, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken. He still walked, but only because William wouldn't let him stop. They developed a rhythm. William would grip Thomas's arm when he stumbled. Thomas would lean on William when the cramps doubled him over. Neither spoke about what was happening because speaking it aloud would make it real. On the fifth night, Thomas whispered that he was sorry. Sorry for being weak. Sorry for slowing William down. Sorry for everything. William wanted to say it wasn't Thomas's fault. That disease didn't care about strength or will or anything human. But his throat was too tight for words, so he just gripped Thomas's shoulder and hoped the gesture conveyed what speech couldn't. Thomas died on the morning of the sixth day. He simply stopped breathing sometime before dawn. his body shutting down from dehydration and exhaustion and the relentless assault of disease that medieval medicine had no answer for. William found him at first light, curled on his side, eyes open and staring at nothing. The sergeant appeared within minutes, summoned by some instinct for death. He checked Thomas's body with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times, then looked at William. "Strip him. Take anything useful. We're not carrying corpses." William's hands moved automatically, following orders his mind couldn't quite process. He removed Thomas's boots, better than William's own, and almost undamaged because Thomas had spent the last 2 days too sick to walk properly. He took the belt, the knife, the few coins Thomas had brought from home, the spear he left because it was worthless. The hardest part was the ring, a simple band of iron on Thomas's left hand, probably his father's or grandfather's, passed down through generations. William knew he should take it. Dead men had no use for rings, but removing it felt like violation, like theft from someone who trusted him. His fingers closed around the metal and pulled, and the ring came free with terrible ease. The sergeant pointed to a spot at the edge of the camp where other bodies lay. 30 or 40 men, all dead in the past week, waiting for a burial that probably wouldn't come. William dragged Thomas's body to the pile and arranged it as carefully as circumstances allowed. Then he stood there staring at his friend's empty face, trying to think of prayers or words or something that would make this moment mean anything. Nothing came. Thomas was dead. William was alive. That was the only truth that mattered. He walked back to his spot in the company, pulled on Thomas's boots and fastened Thomas's belt around his own waist. The boots fit better than his old ones. The belt was good leather, barely worn. Somewhere in his pack was the iron ring, a promise to return it to Thomas's family if William ever made it home. The march continued. More men died. The bodies piled higher at each night's camp. William stopped learning names because names made death personal, and he couldn't afford personal anymore. The man next to him became just a body occupying space. When that body stopped moving, William would strip it and move on. Efficiency replaced humanity because humanity was a luxury the march wouldn't permit. Sergeant Blackwood materialized on the 8th day. William hadn't seen him since the initial assembly, but apparently he'd been moving through the various companies, evaluating men, making his lists. He stopped in front of William, eyes cataloging the stolen boots, the better belt, the hardness that had replaced whatever softness William had started with. Blackwood's voice was neutral. "You're the one who was holding up that boy who died." "Thomas." William nodded, unsure if this was accusation or observation. Blackwood studied him for a long moment. "My brother deserted in the last campaign. I killed him myself. Throat cut. Had to protect the family name." He paused, letting that information settle. "You helped your friend when you should have let him fall. That makes you either stupid or decent. I haven't decided which." Before William could respond, Blackwood moved closer, his voice dropping. "The boy's family. You know them?" William shook his head. "Different village. They'd only met at the assembly." Blackwood's expression didn't change. "Then no one knows if he's dead. No one will come asking for his belongings. You could keep everything. The boots, the belt, the ring I know you took because I saw you take it." The words hung between them. William understood the test. Blackwood was evaluating whether William was the kind of man who'd rob the dead or the kind who'd carry guilt along with stolen boots. William's voice came out rougher than intended. "I'm returning the ring to his family. If I survive, if I don't, someone else can." Blackwood stared at him, then something that might have been respect flickered across his face. "Stupid then. Definitely stupid. Decent men don't survive wars." He made a mark on his list and walked away, leaving William standing in the road wondering what the mark meant. That night rain started. Not the gentle spring rain of home, but a hammering downpour that turned the road into a river and the camp into a swamp. William's carefully stitched blanket jacket soaked through in minutes, the wool holding water like a sponge, doubling in weight. There was no shelter for common soldiers. They huddled in the mud, trying to sleep while rain hammered down and cold seeped into bones that would never quite warm up again. The march the next morning was agony. Wet clothes, chafed skin, raw. boots squelched with each step, water sloshing inside them. The road was ankle-deep in mud that grabbed feet and would try to keep them, turning each step into a battle. Men fell. Some got back up. Others stayed down and were left behind. William's feet began to blister, then the blisters popped, then new blisters formed on top of the raw flesh. Each step was a separate torture, pain lancing up from his feet through legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Around him, other men were experiencing the same degradation. The army was breaking down, dissolving into a column of suffering that moved forward only because stopping meant death. On the 10th day, a rider came through the camp with news. The king's army had won a significant victory at sea, French ships destroyed. The way to France was open. This was greeted with cheers from men too exhausted to understand that good news for the campaign meant they were actually going to reach the battlefield instead of dying on the road. William didn't cheer. He just kept walking. By the second week, his feet were infected. Red streaks climbing from ankle toward calf, the flesh hot and swollen. He could barely walk, each step sending waves of fire through his legs. He knew the signs. Sepsis setting in. Without treatment, the infection would spread, poison his blood, kill him long before any French soldier got the chance. A camp follower noticed him limping. She was older, maybe 40, with a face that had been pretty once before life wore it down. Her name was Marjorie, and she offered to clean his feet for a coin. William had no coins. She looked at his face, shrugged, and told him to sit down anyway. She unwrapped the filthy cloth he'd bound around his feet and made a sound that might have been sympathy or disgust. The infection was bad, spreading fast. She had no real medicine, just water she'd boiled and strips of relatively clean cloth. She cleaned the wounds as gently as she could, which still felt like knives, then bound them with the clean cloth and told him to keep them dry. Keeping them dry was impossible. The rain continued intermittently. The road was permanently mud. But William tried, and Marjorie's minimal intervention seemed to help. The streak stopped climbing. The swelling decreased. He remained mobile, which was the only metric that mattered. Marjorie began appearing at his campsite each evening. Sometimes she cleaned his feet again. Sometimes she just sat nearby, sharing the silence. She'd been following armies for 20 years, she said once. Lost her husband to war, then her sons, then everything else. Following the army was all she had left. At least here she had a purpose. At least here she was useful. William asked what her purpose was. She gave him a look that suggested he knew the answer. She sold companionship to soldiers who wanted to feel human for an hour before going back to being pieces of meat marching towards slaughter. It wasn't noble work. It was survival. Everything in the army was survival. The march stretched into the third week, and the landscape began to change. Fewer farms, more forests. The road improved slightly, old Roman construction that had survived centuries. The pace increased. They were approaching the coast. France was close now. The abstract threat was becoming concrete. On the 19th day, a messenger rode through camp with news that made William's world contract to a single point of horror. Raiders had struck several villages in Yorkshire. Enemy scouts, probing English defenses, burning and looting before disappearing back across the border. Many casualties. Specific villages weren't listed. The messenger rode on before William could ask. He stood frozen while men around him continued their evening routines. Yorkshire, raiders, many casualties. His village could have been hit. Emma, the children. He had no way of knowing. No way to find out except to survive this campaign, return home, and discover what remained. Terror crystallized into something harder. Before, he'd been marching because he had no choice. Now he was marching toward France with a desperate need to finish this, to get through whatever hell waited, to return and verify his family still existed. The not knowing was worse than knowing. Imagination filled the gap with horrors that might not even be real. Blackwood found him that night, staring into the fire, hands clenched so tight his nails drew blood from his palms. The sergeant sat down without invitation, followed William's gaze into the flames. Blackwood's voice was quiet. "You heard about the raids? Your family back there?" William nodded, not trusting speech. Blackwood was silent for a moment. Then, "Nothing you can do from here. Worry is wasted energy. Save it for things you can control. William's voice came out raw. What can I control? Blackwood's answer was immediate. Whether you die like a coward or die like a man, that's the only choice soldiers get. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't meant to be. But it was true, and truth was the only currency that mattered anymore. The march continued for 6 more days before they reached the coast. The sight of the ocean shocked William into momentary wonder, despite everything. He'd never seen anything larger than the river near his village. This endless expanse of water stretching to a horizon that seemed impossible. Ships crowded the harbor, more ships than William had known existed, all waiting to carry soldiers to France. Loading took 2 days of chaos. Men crammed into holds designed for cargo, not people. The smell was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of bodies pressed together, most already sick from the march, all now adding seasickness to their list of miseries. William found a spot near the edge and tried to breathe through his mouth. The crossing took a day and a half. The ship rolled in ways that made the horizon tilt, and William's stomach rebel. He vomited until there was nothing left, then vomited bile, then simply dry heaved while the ship kept moving, and men around him did the same. The hold became a pit of human waste and misery. When they finally landed in France, William stumbled onto solid ground and fell to his knees. French soil, enemy territory, the place where he would probably die. Around him, thousands of other men were doing the same, staggering off ships, collapsing on beaches, grateful for anything that wasn't moving. The army reformed over the next day. Companies that had been separated during the crossing were reassembled. The sick were sorted from the dying. The dying were left at the beach. The sick were expected to march. William counted as sick but mobile. That was enough. They marched inland, following a road that was somehow worse than the English roads had been. French villages appeared and disappeared, most of them abandoned. The locals had fled ahead of the army, taking everything portable and burning what they couldn't carry. Fields lay empty. Wells were poisoned. The French were employing scorched earth tactics, making the invasion feed off its own supplies. Rations grew shorter. The bread became even more sawdust than before. The ale ran out entirely and was replaced with water of questionable safety. Men began dying from starvation as well as disease. The army was consuming itself. On the 31st day since leaving the assembly point, they received word. A French army was gathering ahead, a major force including heavy cavalry. A real battle was coming, not a skirmish or a raid, but a full engagement where thousands would die and the outcome would matter to people who lived in castles and wrote histories. Sergeant Blackwood assembled their company and delivered a speech that was remarkable for its honesty. Most of them would be dead within a week. Those who survived would wish they'd died. War was not glorious. It was not noble. It was simply necessary, and they were the necessary sacrifices. The best he could offer was that dying quickly was better than dying slowly. Aim for quick. That night, priests moved through the camp, hearing confessions. The line stretched forever. Every man wanted to die with a clean soul. William waited his turn, trying to compose thoughts that made sense. When he finally knelt before Father Benedict, the old priest who traveled with them, his confession poured out in a rush. His fear, his guilt about leaving his family, his terror about what the raids might have done to them, his certainty that he was going to die, and his desperate hope that his death would at least mean something. Father Benedict listened without interruption. When William finished, the priest's response was gentle. Your death will mean what all deaths mean. The end of one story. But you're not dead yet. Focus on living well rather than dying well. God judges intentions, not outcomes. The absolution came with a blessing and instructions to fight bravely. William walked away feeling no lighter, but somehow more settled. Tomorrow might bring death. Tonight he was alive. That was enough to focus on. He found Marjorie at her usual spot at the camp's edge. She was mending a shirt, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. He sat down next to her, and after a moment asked if she ever prayed for the men she knew. Marjorie's hands never stopped moving. Every night, every single night. Not because I think it helps, just because it's something. They sat in silence, watching the camp settle into fitful sleep, Knowing tomorrow would bring horror neither could fully imagine, but both had learned enough to fear. The English army reached Crécy-en-Ponthieu on the afternoon of August 25, 1346. The position was a ridge overlooking open ground, defensible terrain that gave archers clear lines of sight and cavalry nowhere to maneuver effectively. King Edward positioned his forces with the precision of someone who understood that geography mattered more than courage. The longbowmen took the flanks. The men-at-arms formed the center. The common infantry, William's company among them, were packed into dense formations behind the front ranks, where they would serve as human weight, pushing forward when the archers had thinned the enemy enough to make pushing possible. William stood in the third rank, billhook gripped in hands that had stopped shaking sometime during the night. The shaking had been replaced by a numb acceptance that felt almost peaceful. Today he would probably die. The mathematics were simple. French forces outnumbered them significantly. French cavalry were the finest in Europe, knights who'd trained for warfare since childhood, mounted on horses bred specifically for combat. Against them stood farmers with farming tools and the desperate hope that arrows would do what courage couldn't. The man directly in front of William was named Edmund, a cooper from somewhere in Kent who talked incessantly during the march about his craft, about the precise measurements required for barrel staves, about wood grain and moisture content. Edmund had talked because silence let fear in. Now he'd gone quiet, his breathing rapid and shallow, his hands white-knuckled around a spear he barely knew how to use. Behind William, someone was praying in Latin, the words running together into a continuous murmur that sounded more like panic than devotion. To his left, a man was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. To his right, someone had already pissed themselves, the stains spreading down their leg. No one commented. Half the company would do the same before the fighting started. Sergeant Black would walk the line, checking spacing, adjusting positions, his face carved from stone. When he reached William, he paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes meeting William's with something that might have been recognition or might have been nothing. Then he moved on, still making marks on his eternal list, still calculating who would survive and who wouldn't. The French army appeared around mid-afternoon, their approach announced by the thunder of thousands of feet and hooves. They flowed across the landscape like a flood, banners streaming, armor glinting in the late summer sun. Even from a distance, they looked invincible, organized, professional. Everything the English army wasn't. William watched them come and felt his brief peace dissolving into terror so profound it was almost transcendent. The French deployed in traditional formation. Genoese crossbowmen in front, thousands of them, hired mercenaries who were supposed to soften the English position before the cavalry charge. Behind them, the flower of French nobility, 15,000 mounted knights in full armor, lances ready, horses stamping with anticipation. It was a formation that had won dozens of battles. There was no reason to think today would be different, except for the mud. The previous night's rain had left the ground soft, not quite saturated, but enough to slow heavy cavalry. And except for the English longbows, weapons that could loose 12 arrows per minute at ranges that made crossbows look primitive, and except for the fact that the French were charging uphill into a defensive position that negated most of their advantages. None of this mattered to William. Strategic considerations were for people who would survive to discuss them. He was focused on the immediate present, on the weight of his billhook, on the pressure of bodies surrounding him, on the frantic beating of his heart that felt too fast, too hard, like it might tear itself apart before the enemy even arrived. The Genoese advanced first, moving within range of the English archers. They began loosing bolts, the crossbows making sharp cracking sounds as the mechanisms released. Bolts hissed through the air, arcing toward the English lines. Most fell short or wide. A few found targets. Somewhere to William's right, a man screamed as a bolt punched through his shoulder. The scream was high and terrible and cut off abruptly. Then the English archers responded. 5,000 longbows releasing simultaneously created a sound like the earth itself exhaling. The arrows rose in a cloud so dense it darkened the sky, hung for a moment at the apex, then fell like judgment. The sound of 5,000 arrows hitting their targets was something William would hear in nightmares for the rest of his life. A combination of impacts on wood, on metal, on flesh, all blending into a continuous roar punctuated by screams. The Genoese line staggered. Men fell by the hundreds, arrows protruding from bodies, from faces, from limbs. The crossbowmen tried to reload, but reloading took time, 30 seconds or more, and the English archers were already loosing their second volley. The third volley broke the Genoese completely. The survivors turned and ran, abandoning their weapons, their wounded, their dead, fleeing back toward their own cavalry. The French knights, rather than letting them through, began cutting them down. William watched in disbelief as French nobility slaughtered their own mercenaries for the crime of retreating. Bodies fell under French lances and swords, adding to the carnage the English had already inflicted. Edmund's voice was a whisper. "They're killing their own men. Why are they killing their own men?" William had no answer. Nothing about this made sense. War was supposed to have rules, some logic, but watching knights massacre fleeing crossbowmen suggested that chaos was the only constant. The French cavalry began their charge before the Genoese bodies had finished falling. 15,000 knights spurring their mounts forward, lances lowered, the ground shaking from their approach. They came uphill through mud and over corpses, and despite everything that should have slowed them, they were still the most terrifying thing William had ever seen. Each knight was a fortress of metal mounted on 1,000 pounds of trained aggression. Each one cost more than William's village produced in a decade, and there were thousands of them. The English archers shifted targets, arrows designed to pierce armor, bodkin points that could punch through mail, and sometimes plate, began falling into the French cavalry. Horses screamed. The sound was worse than human screaming, high-pitched and agonized, cutting through all other noise. Horses fell, throwing riders. Other horses stumbled over fallen mounts. The charge began to disorganize, the neat lines breaking into a chaotic mass. But they kept coming. Despite losses that would have broken any normal force, the French cavalry pressed forward with the determination of men who'd been told since birth that they were invincible. They reached the English lines while William was still trying to process that they'd actually made it through the arrow storm. The impact when the cavalry hit the English front ranks was like listening to a building collapse. The sound of metal, on wood, on flesh and bone, all merging into a cacophony that obliterated thought. Edmund in front of William disappeared, just vanished as a horse crashed into him, with enough force to send his body flying backward. The horse kept coming, its eyes rolling white, foam spraying from its mouth. William's billhook moved without conscious thought, muscle memory from farm work translating into a thrust that caught the horse's chest. The blade sank deep. The horse's momentum carried it forward despite the wound, crushing into the second rank, driving William backward into the men behind him. The pressure was instant and overwhelming. Bodies pressed from all sides, making breathing difficult, movement impossible. The horse was thrashing, dying slowly, its hooves striking anything in range. One hoof caught the man next to William in the head, caving in his skull with a wet crunch. Blood and brain matter sprayed across William's face, hot and sticky. He tried to wipe it away, but his arms were pinned by the press of bodies. A knight emerged from the chaos, having been thrown from his dying mount. He was on foot now, but still armed with a sword that looked sharp enough to split bone. He swung at the nearest target, which happened to be a spearman who tried to block and failed. The sword cut through the wooden shaft and continued into the man's chest, opening him from shoulder to sternum. Someone from behind William stabbed at the knight with a spear, hitting the armor but not penetrating. The knight turned, faster than anyone in full plate should be able to move, and grabbed the spear. He yanked hard, pulling the spearman forward off balance, then drove his sword into the gap where helmet met breastplate. The spearman's scream gurgled into silence. William couldn't move, couldn't retreat, couldn't do anything except watch as the knight killed a third man, then a fourth. Then someone from the second rank thrust a spear into the knight's armpit, one of the few gaps in plate armor, and the blade went deep. The knight staggered, his arm going limp, and another spear took him in the throat above the gorget. He fell slowly, like a tree being felled, his armor making him rigid even in death. The first charge broke against the English line like water against stone. The French cavalry that had seemed unstoppable were being channeled into kill zones where archers could target them at close range and infantry could stab at horses' legs. The ground became a nightmare landscape of dying horses and dismounted knights struggling in armor that was protective but cumbersome. William gasped for air, the pressure easing slightly as the French pulled back to regroup. Bodies surrounded him. Edmund was somewhere underneath, trampled beyond recognition. The man whose skull had been crushed by the horse's hoof lay at an angle that made his neck look broken in addition to his head. The spearman who'd been split open was still technically alive, making bubbling sounds as blood filled his lungs. Blackwood appeared, moving through the carnage with practiced efficiency, checking who was dead, who was dying, who could still fight. When he reached William, he gave him a single assessing look. Still breathing. Good. Tighten the ranks. They'll charge again. William wanted to ask how many more times, but Blackwood was already moving, already pulling men into position, replacing the dead with whoever was still standing. The line reformed, shorter now, gaps filled with men from the rear ranks who stepped over bodies to take their places. The French charged again and again. Each time the pattern repeated. The thunder of hooves, the arrow storm, the impact, the killing, the retreat. The English line held not through superior skill, but through sheer density of bodies. There was nowhere to run, even if men wanted to. The press of soldiers behind prevented retreat, and the French in front prevented advance. The only option was to stand and thrust weapons at anything that came close enough. During a lull between the third and fourth charges, William realized he'd lost his billhook. He didn't remember dropping it. It was just gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of bodies and blood. He scrabbled around searching and found a sword instead, taken from a dead knight's hand. The sword was heavier than his billhook, balanced differently, the edge notched from use. He gripped it and tried to remember if he'd ever actually used a sword before. Farm tools didn't translate to weapons designed specifically for killing humans. The fourth charge came faster than expected. The French had learned from previous failures and adjusted tactics, sending cavalry in waves instead of all at once, trying to overwhelm specific points rather than the entire line. The wave hit William's section with concentrated force. Horses crashed into the formation like living battering rams. Men were crushed, trampled, scattered. William swung the sword at a horse's leg, the blade biting into muscle and tendon. The horse collapsed, throwing its rider. The knight hit the ground hard but was already trying to rise, protected by armor that absorbed impacts that would have killed an unarmored man. William stepped forward, raising the sword for an overhead strike, and brought it down toward the gap between helmet and breastplate. The blade connected but glanced off, his angle wrong, his strength insufficient against quality steel. The knight rolled faster than should be possible in full armor and grabbed William's leg. The grip was iron strong. William fell, hitting the mud face first, the sword flying from his grasp. The knight was on top of him now, heavy enough to press William into the ground. One armored hand closing around William's throat. Pressure, crushing pressure. William couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't do anything except scrabble uselessly at metal gauntlets. His vision began to darken at the edges. This was death, suffocation under a French knight's grip while lying in mud that smelled like blood and shit, and the dissolution of everything human. Then the pressure released. The knight's weight shifted, then lifted completely. William gasped air, rolling onto his back, vision clearing enough to see Blackwood standing over him, a bloodied knife in his hand. The knight was on his side, no longer moving, Blackwood's blade having found the armpit gap and gone deep enough to matter. Blackwood grabbed William's arm and hauled him upright with surprising strength for his size. "Get up. You're not dying in the mud like livestock." William wanted to thank him, but there was no time. The fighting had moved, the French cavalry being pushed back again, but at horrific cost. Bodies carpeted the ground in layers. You couldn't see earth anymore, only corpses and the mud they were creating through their collective bleeding out. The fifth charge came as the sun began its descent toward evening. This one was different, desperate. The French nobility realized they were losing and threw everything into breaking the English line before darkness made further fighting impossible. Knights charged with suicidal determination, some dismounting to fight on foot where horses couldn't navigate the corpse field, All of them focused on punching through to where the English king's banner flew. William found himself pushed forward as the formation compressed under pressure. He was in the second rank now, most of the first having been killed. In front of him, a gap opened as someone fell. Through that gap came a dismounted knight, younger than William expected, maybe 19 or 20, his face visible through his raised visor. The knight thrust with a sword that was longer and better than William's lost blade. The point aimed at William's chest. William twisted. The blade scraped across his ribs, cutting through cloth and skin, but not deep enough to reach anything vital. Pain lanced through his side, sharp and burning. He swung instinctively with his fist, connecting with the knight's face through the open visor. The knight staggered. William grabbed a spear from someone who just died, reversed it, and drove the point toward the knight's throat. The spear hit Mail, slid down, found the gap where Mail met plate at the collarbone, and punched through. The knight's eyes went wide, shock replacing aggression. Blood bubbled from his mouth. His sword dropped from fingers that no longer worked. He fell to his knees, then forward, the spear still embedded in his throat. William stared at what he'd done. The knight was his age, maybe younger, dying slowly, drowning in his own blood, eyes locked on William's face with an expression that might have been accusation or might have been simple disbelief. William wanted to look away but couldn't. He'd killed this man. Not abstractly, not through the fog of battle where responsibility could be diffused, but directly and personally with enough awareness to make it real. The knight's fingers scrabbled weakly at the spear shaft, trying to pull it free. The movement was futile. Already his eyes were glazing, the light fading. He made a sound that might have been a word or might have been nothing. Then he was still, body relaxing into death's permanent posture. William bent over and vomited, his body rejecting what his mind refused to process. Nothing came up except bile, burning his throat. Around him the battle continued, men fighting and dying, while he stood frozen, staring at the corpse he'd created. Blackwood's voice cut through his paralysis. "Strip the body. That armor's worth more than you'll earn in 10 lifetimes." William's hands moved mechanically, following orders because orders were simpler than thought. He removed the dead knight's sword belt, better quality than anything William had owned. The knife, the purse attached to the belt, a ring from the knight's finger that resisted removal until William twisted hard enough to hear bone crack. The knight's face was still visible, still young, still dead because of William. He wanted to close the eyes, provide some final dignity, but dignity was another luxury this place didn't permit. He took what was useful and left the corpse for whoever came after. The sixth charge failed before it properly began. The French cavalry was exhausted, their horses blown, their numbers significantly reduced. They attempted to regroup, but the English archers had arrow supply remaining and used it with brutal efficiency. Knights fell from their mounts before the charge gained momentum. Horses stumbled over bodies. The attack dissolved into a confused mass that retreated in disorder. The seventh charge never came. As twilight settled over Crécy, the French army pulled back, leaving thousands of dead behind. The English held the field. The battle was won. Victory felt like surviving a flood. Relief mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the guilt of being alive when so many weren't. William stood in his position as the formation slowly dissolved, men collapsing where they stood, too tired to move, too shocked to celebrate. Blackwood moved through the company, taking count. Out of 200 men who'd formed ranks that morning, 63 remained standing. The rest were dead, dying, or wounded badly enough to make survival unlikely. Blackwood made marks on his list with the same mechanical efficiency he'd shown all campaign, tallying losses like a clerk recording inventory. When he reached William, he stopped. His eyes went to the sword belt William now wore, to the blood coating William's front, to the hollow expression that probably mirrored what Blackwood saw in every other survivor. "You killed your first knight today. How do you feel?" William's voice was raw. "Like I murdered someone." Blackwood's expression might have softened fractionally. "That's because you did. War doesn't change the nature of killing. It just provides justification." He paused, then continued in a voice so quiet William almost missed it. "My brother looked at me the way that knight looked at you. Right before I cut his throat. It doesn't get easier. You just get harder or you break. Before William could respond, Blackwood moved on, leaving William standing among the dead with the weight of new knowledge settling into his bones. He'd crossed some threshold. On one side was the person he'd been, a farmer who'd never intentionally hurt anyone. On the other side was this, someone who could drive a spear through a stranger's throat and watch him die. Night fell completely, and with it came the sounds of the wounded. Thousands of men scattered across the battlefield, English and French mixed together, crying out for help that mostly wouldn't come. The sounds were worse than the battle itself. Screams, moans, desperate pleas in multiple languages, all of them expressing the same universal language of agony. Orders came down prohibiting any attempt to help French wounded. The English wounded were being collected, triaged into categories of might survive versus definitely dying. The definitely dying were given water, if any was available, and left to their business of dying. The might survive were carried to areas where camp followers and the few surgeons accompanying the army attempted basic treatment that mostly consisted of amputation and prayer. William wandered the battlefield because staying still meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting what he'd done. Bodies were everywhere, piled so thick in some areas you couldn't see ground. Most were French, killed by arrows or trampled in the chaos. The English dead were mixed in, identifiable by their lack of armor and the farming tools many still clutched. He found Edmund's body underneath a dead horse, so thoroughly crushed that identification was only possible by the fragment of his cooper's tunic still visible. William stood over what remained of the man who'd talked obsessively about barrel staves to keep fear at bay, and felt nothing. The numbness was spreading, replacing emotion with a void that felt safer than feeling. Movement caught his attention. A French knight, wounded but alive, pinned under his dead horse, trying to free himself. The knight was young, maybe 18, his face tear-streaked, babbling in French. William approached slowly, instinct telling him this was dangerous even though the knight was clearly helpless. The knight saw him, and the babbling increased, words tumbling over each other. William couldn't understand French, but tone was universal. The knight was begging for help, for mercy, for something that William had the power to give or withhold. The knight's leg was crushed under the horse, probably broken in multiple places. Even if freed, he'd never walk properly again. Infection would set in within days. He'd die slowly and painfully unless someone showed enough mercy to make it quick. William stood there, looking at this boy whose life was in his hands, and felt the weight of the choice. He could walk away, pretend he'd never seen this, let nature take its course, or he could do what mercy demanded and what every instinct screamed against. The knight's eyes met his. In them, William saw the same fear he'd felt under the knight's grip earlier, the same desperate desire to live, even when living meant agony. The knight whispered something that sounded like water. Oh, the French word filtered through William's exhaustion. William knelt, pulled out his water skin, and held it to the knight's lips. The knight drank desperately, water spilling down his chin, mixing with tears. When the water was gone, he whispered something else. Merci. Thank you. William stayed there, crouched beside this dying enemy, and for reasons he couldn't articulate, he didn't leave. He sat with the knight as darkness deepened, as the sounds of the wounded gradually decreased through the night as men slipped away. The knight's breathing grew more labored, his body shutting down from shock and injury. Around dawn, he simply stopped breathing, his face relaxing into peace that seemed obscene given the circumstances. William realized he was crying. Not for the knight specifically, but for everything. For Thomas dying of dysentery. For Edmund crushed under a horse. For the young knight he'd killed with a spear. For this boy who died while William held vigil. For his family whose fate he didn't know. For the person he'd been before all this. Blackwood found him there as the sun rose. The sergeant looked at the dead French knight, at William's tears, at the water skin lying empty beside them. His expression was unreadable. You gave him water, stayed with him while he died. William nodded, unable to speak. Blackwood crouched down, his voice carrying an edge William hadn't heard before. I watched my brother die after I killed him, held his hand while the blood drained out. Told myself it was necessary. He looked directly at William. You showed this boy mercy when mercy wasn't required. That makes you either soft or human. The army prefers soft men dead and human men broken. Watch yourself. He stood and walked away, leaving William sitting beside the French knight's corpse as the sun illuminated the full scope of yesterday's slaughter. Bodies stretched across the field in every direction, thousands of them, maybe 10,000 French dead versus a few hundred English. A decisive victory by any military measure, a catastrophe by any human one. The scavengers arrived with full daylight. Camp followers, local peasants who'd hidden during the battle, opportunistic soldiers from both sides, all descending on the field to strip the dead. Armor, weapons, rings, coins, anything valuable was systematically removed. Bodies were searched with mechanical efficiency, turned over, emptied of valuables, left naked to the elements. William joined because orders required it and because the alternative was thinking. He stripped French knights of armor he couldn't carry, weapons he didn't need, coins that felt like blood money but was currency nonetheless. Each body he searched was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's husband. Each ring removed was a family that wouldn't know what happened, wouldn't have remains to bury, wouldn't have closure. He found the young knight he'd killed with the spear. Someone had already taken the armor, the sword, everything of obvious value. But they'd missed the small medallion around his neck, tucked beneath the mail shirt, a religious icon of some Saint William didn't recognize. He pulled it free and added it to his collection of guilt. By midday, the battlefield had been thoroughly picked clean. The French bodies lay naked and bloating in the sun. The English dead had been collected and buried in mass graves at the field's edge, simple holes dug by men too tired to make them deep. Father Benedict moved among the graves, offering blessings that felt inadequate against the scale of death. William found himself in line for confession again, needing to purge what he'd done, needing someone to tell him that killing in war was different from murder, even though his soul knew it wasn't. When his turn came, the words spilled out in a rush. He'd killed a knight, given water to another, watched him die, stripped corpses like they were resources instead of people. He'd stopped seeing the dead as human and wasn't sure he could remember how to see them as human again. Father Benedict's response was gentle but firm. War forces choices between survival and sanity. You chose mercy when you could. That matters more than you think. The killing was necessary. The water wasn't. Remember that distinction. The absolution came with instructions to pray for both the men he'd killed and the men he'd helped. William walked away feeling no lighter, but perhaps marginally less hollow. That evening, a messenger arrived with updated casualty reports from the raids on English villages. More details this time. Specific locations. Numbers of dead. Property destroyed. William scanned the list with hands that trembled so badly he could barely hold the parchment. His village was listed. Raiders had struck in force. 8 dead. Numerous buildings burned. Significant property loss. The names of the dead weren't provided, just the count. 8. A small number in the context of war, a catastrophic number when it was your village, possibly your family. William's world contracted to a single point of desperate mathematics. 8 dead out of maybe 200 villagers. Most likely victims would be men who tried to resist. But Emma might have resisted to protect the children, or the children might have been caught in the crossfire, or their house being burned might have trapped them, or 1,000 other scenarios his mind generated with cruel efficiency. Blackwood appeared beside him, reading over his shoulder. 8 dead. Could be worse. William's voice came out strangled. Could be my family. Blackwood's response was blunt. Could be. Won't know until you get home. So focus on getting home. Everything else is wasted energy. The logic was sound but impossible to follow. William's mind kept cycling through scenarios, each one worse than the last. Emma defending the children with a kitchen knife, Mary hiding in a closet, John trying to act brave and getting cut down, Sarah crying while the house burned around her. The images were vivid enough to feel real, terrible enough to paralyze. That night, William didn't sleep. He lay staring at stars that seemed impossibly distant and indifferent, holding Thomas's iron ring, the dead knight's medallion, the accumulated weight of objects taken from corpses. Each item represented a story cut short, a life terminated, a family that would grieve. Around him, other survivors were processing the battle in their own ways. Some drank, seeking oblivion in whatever alcohol they could trade for or steal. Some prayed, trying to reconcile what they'd done with what they believed. Some sat in silence, staring at nothing, already half gone to the places survivors went when reality became unendurable. Marjorie found him in the darkness. She sat down without speaking, her presence a comfort simply through proximity. After a long silence, her voice emerged, quiet and weary. "You hear about the village raids?" William nodded. She continued. 20 years I've been following armies. Every campaign, men get news from home. Bad news mostly. Villages burned. Families killed. And there's nothing they can do except finish the campaign and hope something remains when they return. William's voice was barely audible. How do they bear it? Marjorie's answer came slowly, each word carefully chosen. They don't. Not really. They just push it down deep enough that they can function. Then they go home and spend the rest of their lives trying to push it deeper. Some succeed, most don't. The honesty was brutal but somehow helpful. At least she wasn't offering false comfort or meaningless platitudes. She was acknowledging that this was unbearable and would remain unbearable, and the only choice was whether to bear it anyway or break completely. William asked what she thought he should do. Marjorie's response was immediate. Survive. Get home. Find out the truth. If your family's alive, be there for them. If they're not, grieve them properly. But first, survive. Everything else is secondary. The simplicity was almost appealing. Reduce everything to survival. Make that the only goal. Ignore the guilt, the fear, the uncertainty. Just keep breathing until circumstances permitted something beyond breathing. Days blurred together after Crécy. The English army didn't pursue the defeated French, but instead moved toward Calais, a port city that would become the site of a lengthy siege. For William and the common soldiers, this meant more marching through hostile territory, more short rations, more disease eating through the ranks. But the dynamic had shifted. They'd won a major battle, survived something that should have killed them. That counted for something, even if it didn't feel like victory. The survivors developed a grim camaraderie, bonds formed through shared trauma that transcended the normal limits of friendship. William found himself gravitating toward others who'd been at Crécy. They didn't talk much about the battle itself, but there was understanding in their silence, recognition that they'd been changed by something that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't experienced it. Blackwood began treating William differently, not with warmth or anything resembling friendship, but with the grudging respect one survivor showed another. He'd stop by William's spot in camp occasionally, sharing whatever intelligence he'd gathered, offering advice about avoiding disease or treating wounds. The interactions were brief and functional, but they mattered. One evening, Blackwood sat down and pulled out a flask. He took a long drink, then offered it to William. The liquid was harsh enough to burn going down, probably some local alcohol that was more poison than spirits. Blackwood's voice was rough from the drink. You asked me once about my brother, about why I killed him? William waited, knowing this story was being offered, not demanded. Blackwood continued. He deserted 3 days before a major battle, got caught trying to flee to Scotland. Command gave me a choice. Kill him myself and preserve the family name, or he'd be hanged publicly and the family stripped of lands. He paused, staring into the fire. I chose the family, cut his throat in a tent, held him while he bled out, watched his eyes go empty. William didn't know what to say. Any response felt inadequate. Blackwood's voice dropped lower. He begged me not to, said he'd go back to the line, fight bravely, do whatever was needed. But orders were orders, and family was family. So I killed him. His expression was stone. You gave that French knight water. I couldn't even give my brother mercy. That's the difference between soft and hard. You're still soft. I'm hard enough to break. He stood and walked away, leaving William with the flask and the weight of understanding that everyone here carried unbearable burdens. That trauma wasn't exceptional, but universal. that the army was simply a collection of damaged men pretending to be soldiers. Word came in early September. The siege of Calais would take months. Those soldiers not required for siege work would be released, allowed to return to England with the promise of recall if needed. The criteria for release were unclear, but it seemed to involve those who'd survived Crécy and weren't useful for siege operations. Men like William, essentially, who had farming to return to and lacked skills for building siege engines or manning walls. When the list was posted, William's name was on it. He'd be part of a group marching back to the coast, boarding ships for England, returning to whatever remained of home. The relief was overwhelming and terrifying in equal measure. He'd survived. Against every odd, every expectation, every reasonable prediction, he'd survived. Now he had to face whatever that survival meant. Blackwood found him the day before departure. The sergeant handed him a small leather pouch, heavy with coins, more money than William had seen in his life. Your share of the plunder, from Crécy, the armor and weapons your company stripped. Command takes most, but soldiers get portions. His expression was serious. Use it wisely. Money won't fix what's broken, but it can rebuild what's burned. William tried to thank him, but Blackwood cut him off. Don't thank me. Just survive whatever comes next. That's harder than surviving battles. The sergeant walked away for the last time, still carrying his list, still calculating odds and survival rates for men who would fight in sieges William wouldn't see. The march back to the coast took 2 weeks. The group was smaller, maybe 300 men, all heading home with wounds visible and invisible. They moved faster without the full army's logistics, covering ground that had taken weeks on the journey out. William spent the march in contemplation, trying to prepare for what he'd find. Best case, Emma and the children alive, the house damaged but repairable, the land still theirs. Worst case, graves and ashes and nothing left to return to. Everything between those extremes seemed possible, and he had no way to predict which reality waited. They reached the coast on September 18th. The Channel crossing took a day, the ship crowded with men eager to reach England and terrified of what they'd discover there. William stood at the railing, watching the English coast emerge from morning mist, and felt his chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. England, home, the place he'd left 5 months ago as a farmer and returned to as something else. Someone who'd killed, someone who'd survived, someone fundamentally changed by experiences that couldn't be unchanged. The ship docked at Dover. Men scattered immediately, each heading toward their own villages, their own uncertainties. William started walking north toward Yorkshire, toward whatever remained of his life. The journey would take weeks. Every step closer increased both hope and dread in equal measure. He stopped in the first village he reached and spent some of Blackwood's coins on a hot meal, the first real food he'd eaten in months. The bread was fresh. The stew had actual meat. The ale was clean. It should have tasted like heaven, but instead tasted like ash, because eating comfort food while his family's fate remained unknown felt like betrayal. Other men in the tavern were veterans too, their scarred faces and hollow eyes marking them as survivors of campaigns they'd never fully explain. They nodded to each other in recognition, a silent acknowledgement of shared experience, then focused on their meals in private silence. William asked the innkeeper about news from Yorkshire, the raids, the casualties, any information that might help him prepare. The innkeeper knew only rumors. Yorkshire had been hit hard, multiple villages, many dead. Specific details were scarce because communication was slow and unreliable. He slept that night in a real bed for the first time since leaving home and couldn't sleep. The mattress felt too soft after months on the ground. The silence felt wrong after months of camp noise. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember Emma's face clearly and finding the memory corrupted by exhaustion and trauma. The nightmare came around dawn. He was back at Crécy, watching the young knight die with the spear in his throat, except the knight's face kept changing. First it was the French boy who'd begged for water, then it was Thomas, dying of dysentery, then it was Edmund, crushed under the horse, then it was John, his 8-year-old son, looking at him with betrayed eyes. William woke gasping, his heart hammering. his body drenched in sweat. The innkeeper's wife found him like that and brought water without comment. Her eyes held understanding that suggested she'd seen this before. Veterans fighting battles in their sleep that would never end. The journey continued, village by village, mile by mile, getting closer to Yorkshire, and the moment when uncertainty would resolve into whatever truth waited. William walked with a desperation that had replaced exhaustion, covering distances he'd never have managed before the campaign, driven by need that overrode physical limitations. 2 weeks after landing in England, he reached his region. Familiar landmarks appeared. The river he'd fished in as a child, the forest where he'd hunted, the crossroads where the bailiff had first assembled them. Everything looked exactly the same and completely different. Reality filtered through the lens of what he'd become. His village appeared on the horizon, and William stopped walking. From this distance, he could see buildings. Some were clearly damaged, roofs missing or walls charred. But structures remained. The village existed. That was something. He started walking again, faster now, close enough that details began to resolve. The miller's house was gone, just a burned foundation. The blacksmith's workshop had lost its roof. Other buildings showed arrow damage, evidence of fighting that his absence had forced others to face. People emerged as he entered the village. Familiar faces, though many were missing. They stared at him with expressions ranging from relief to accusation. He'd left and they'd stayed and paid for his absence. Then Emma appeared, stepping out from her brother's house, and William's world contracted to a single point. She was alive. Thinner than he remembered, exhausted looking, wearing clothes that had been mended multiple times, but alive. Behind her, 3 small figures emerged. John, taller than William remembered. Mary holding Sarah, who'd grown from infant to toddler. Emma saw him and froze. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the distance. 2 people who'd been changed by different traumas, uncertain how to bridge the gap. Then Emma moved, crossing the space between them, and collapsed against him, her body shaking with sobs she'd been holding for months. William held her, feeling her alive and real against him, and something that had been frozen since Crécy began to thaw. She was alive. They were alive. He'd survived to discover them alive. John approached cautiously, looking at his father with eyes that held new wariness. Mary hid behind her brother, clutching Sarah, all 3 children treating him like a stranger who happened to look like their father. Emma pulled back, her hands framing his face, searching his eyes for the person he'd been. Her voice was rough from crying. "You came back. I didn't think you'd come back." William wanted to say he'd always planned to return, but the words stuck because he hadn't been sure he'd survive long enough to return. So instead, he said the only thing that mattered. "I'm here. I'm home." The words were true but incomplete. His body was home. His mind was still scattered across French fields, watching men die, holding vigil over enemies, becoming someone his family wouldn't recognize. Coming home was supposed to be an ending. Instead, it felt like a new kind of battle, one without clear enemies or victory conditions, where survival looked different but remained just as uncertain. The house was ash and memory. William stood at the edge of what had been his home, looking at blackened timber and collapsed walls, trying to map the present destruction onto his recollection of where things had been. The hearth remained, stone immune to fire, sitting like a gravestone marking where a family had once cooked meals and told stories. Everything else was erasure. Emma's voice came from behind him, flat with the exhaustion of someone who'd already grieved this loss and moved past it. The raiders came at dawn. They fired arrows first onto the thatch. By the time we realized what was happening, the roof was burning. We got out with what we could carry. That was nothing. William turned to face her, searching for blame in her expression and finding only the same weariness he'd brought back from France. She'd fought her own battle here while he'd been fighting his across the channel. Neither had won anything except survival, and survival felt increasingly hollow as the only prize. The children stood apart, a small cluster of wariness watching their father examine ruins. John held Mary's hand while Mary held Sarah, the 3 of them forming a unit that didn't include William. The mathematics of absence were simple. 5 months away had transformed him from father into stranger, someone who wore their father's face but carried different eyes, moved with different rhythms, flinched at sounds only he could hear. Emma's brother had taken them in, she explained. His house was crowded now but functional. 7 people sharing space meant for 4. The arrangement was temporary because everything was temporary, because rebuilding required resources they didn't have, and time that harvest season wouldn't permit. The fields William had partially planted before leaving had been finished by whoever could spare hours, which meant poorly. The harvest would be light. Winter would be hard. William pulled out the leather pouch Blackwood had given him, heavy with coins from Crécy's plunder. He pressed it into Emma's hands, watching her face shift from confusion to shock as she registered the weight. From the battle. My share of what we took from the French dead. It's enough to rebuild, enough for seed, enough for winter. Emma stared at the coins, her fingers trembling as she counted wealth that exceeded anything they'd imagined accumulating. Then her eyes found his, searching for something she apparently didn't find. Where did this come from? Whose money was this? The answer sat heavy in William's throat. Dead men's money, knights I killed or helped kill, armor and weapons stripped from corpses, blood money purchased with French lives. Emma's grip tightened on the pouch, her jaw set. We'll use it. We have to use it. But don't tell me it came from nowhere. Don't pretend it's clean. William couldn't argue because she was right. Nothing from Crécy was clean. Everything he'd brought back carried the stain of what he'd done to acquire it. But stained money bought food and timber, same as clean money, and his family needed both. The rebuilding began the next day, though William's participation was limited by limitations he hadn't anticipated. His hands knew how to grip hammer and saw, but his mind kept fracturing, splitting attention between present tasks and past horrors. He'd be raising a beam and suddenly smell burning flesh from Crécy's aftermath. He'd be sawing timber and hear screaming that nobody else could hear. His body was in Yorkshire, but significant portions of his consciousness remained in France. John worked beside him, the boy's strength surprising for 8 years, his silence even more surprising. They'd been close before William left, easy affection between father and son that required no performance. That comfort was gone now, replaced by careful distance. John treated him with the respect due to authority, but none of the warmth due to family. On the 3rd day of rebuilding, William dropped his hammer mid-swing and stumbled backward, breathing too fast. Vision tunneling. John stared at him with eyes too old for his age, then picked up the hammer and continued working without comment. The message was clear. Whatever was broken in William, John had learned not to rely on him. Emma found him that evening sitting alone behind the ruins, staring at nothing. She lowered herself beside him, close enough for contact but not touching, respecting whatever barrier he erected. You're not sleeping. I hear you walking at night, pacing. Sometimes you cry out. Her voice carried no judgment, only observation. The children hear it too. They're frightened. William wanted to explain, but explanation required words he didn't have. How do you describe nightmares where dead men return wearing faces of people you love? How do you convey the sensation of waking convinced you're still in the press of battle, surrounded by dying enemies, unable to distinguish past from present? Emma continued when he didn't respond. The raiders, when they came, I killed one. He broke into the house while it was burning. I was getting the children out, and he tried to stop me. I had a kitchen knife. I stabbed him. Her hands were steady as she spoke, not trembling despite the confession. He died on our floor while the ceiling fell around him. William turned to look at her, seeing his wife differently now. She'd crossed the same threshold he had, taken a life to preserve others, carried the weight of what necessity demanded. They were both killers, both survivors, both changed. Emma's eyes met his. So I understand. Whatever you saw, whatever you did, I understand carrying it. But the children don't understand. They just know their father left and someone else came back. The truth of that cut deeper than any blade had managed. William's absence had been meant to protect John, to prevent his son from experiencing war's horror. Instead, it had subjected his entire family to different horrors while transforming William into someone his children feared. The sacrifice had protected nothing. Weeks passed in a blur of reconstruction and failed adaptation. The house took shape through the labor of villagers who helped because community survival required mutual support. William worked when his mind permitted, which was less often than pride demanded. His body was present but unreliable, prone to episodes where present dissolved into past, and he became useless until reality reasserted itself. The village treated him with the careful distance reserved for dangerous things. Other men had returned from the campaign, not many, and they formed a loose association of the damaged. They'd gather at the tavern when coins permitted, drinking in silence or telling fragments of stories that never captured the full truth, because full truth couldn't be spoken in places where civilians pretended normalcy existed. One evening, William found himself sitting across from Harold, a man from 2 villages over who'd been at Crécy in a different company. Harold had lost his left arm to a French sword, the stump healed but useless, his entire livelihood as a blacksmith erased by a single blow. They drank without speaking for a long time before Harold's voice emerged, rough and bitter. "I dream about the moment, the sword coming down, my arm falling," the French bastard laughing. "Every night the same dream, except sometimes it's my son's arm falling. Sometimes it's both arms. Sometimes I wake up and check to make sure the arm is really gone, because the dreams where I still have it are worse than the dreams where I lose it again." William understood. The dreams were democracy's cruelest joke, inflicting equal suffering on all survivors, regardless of visible wounds. He shared his own nightmares. The young knight with the spear in his throat whose face kept changing. The French boy who died while William held vigil. The compression of bodies at Crécy's impact moment where breathing became optional and death felt preferable to continued existence. Harold listened, then offered the only truth that mattered. "We're broken, all of us who went and came back. Broken in ways that don't heal because the damage is somewhere medicine doesn't reach." They drank to that bitter wisdom, toasting brokenness because acknowledging it was marginally better than pretending wholeness they'd never reclaim. The harvest came and proved as inadequate as Emma had predicted. The fields William had partially planted before leaving, and others had finished poorly, produced roughly 60% of normal yield. 60% meant hungry winter, rationed food, children eating less than growth required. William stared at the meager stores in their rebuilt home and calculated margins that kept arriving at the same conclusion. They'd survive but barely, perpetually one disaster away from catastrophe. Emma stood beside him, tallying the same mathematics, reaching the same grim conclusions. "We'll manage. We always manage." Her tone suggested she believed this roughly as much as he did, which was not at all, but belief was luxury and they dealt in necessities. John had grown taller over the summer, his body demanding calories they couldn't spare. William watched his son eat smaller portions without complaint and felt fresh guilt layering over existing accumulation. The boy he'd sacrificed everything to protect was suffering anyway, just differently, starving slowly because his father's absence had disrupted planting while his presence disrupted the family's functioning. October brought the first frost, and with it, news that settled like lead in William's stomach. Another campaign was forming. King Edward wanted to consolidate gains from Crécy, push further into France, finish what had been started. The call for soldiers would come again soon. Men who'd served could be recalled. Those who refused would face charges of desertion. William read the announcement posted in the village square and felt the trap closing again. He'd survived once. The odds of surviving twice approached zero, but refusing meant losing everything they just rebuilt, condemning his family to destitution or worse. The feudal system's mathematics remained unchanged. Your life belonged to your lord, who'd loaned it to you temporarily, subject to recall whenever political necessity demanded bodies for foreign fields. That night, Emma found him staring at the fire, Thomas's iron ring clutched in one hand, the French knight's medallion in the other. She sat down, her presence solid and warm, an anchor to present when past kept pulling. "They're calling men again." Her voice was steady, not quite question, not quite statement. William nodded, unable to speak past the constriction in his throat. Emma's hand covered his, her fingers wrapping around the ring and medallion, around his fist and the guilt he carried. "You don't have to go. We'll find another way." William's voice came out strangled. "Desertion means death, means losing the land, means you and the children sold to cover debts. There is no other way." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. Then her voice emerged, harder than before. "Then we pay the exemption. Use the French gold. Buy your way out." The possibility hadn't occurred to William, exemption being something wealthy men purchased, not farmers. But Emma was right. They had money now, blood money that could purchase continued life. The mathematics shifted. Use the plunder to avoid creating more plunder. Transform dead knights' gold into living fathers' presents. The exemption cost most of what remained from Crécy, but the bailiff accepted payment with the indifference of someone who cared only about meeting quotas, not about who filled them. William was removed from the levy list, his name scratched out, his obligations satisfied through coin rather than service. Relief was immediate and complicated. He'd bought his way out of dying, but also out of the only context where his damage made sense. Among soldiers, his nightmares were normal. His hypervigilance was understood. His inability to celebrate life was shared currency. Here, among civilians who hadn't experienced what he had, his brokenness became pathology rather than adaptation. John learned of the exemption, and his reaction was fury William hadn't anticipated. The boy confronted him outside the house, voice high and tight with emotions he hadn't been taught to process. "You're a coward. You paid to avoid fighting. You're less than the men who went." The accusation landed like physical blows. William tried to explain that he'd already fought, already done his part, already earned whatever right existed to avoid going again. But John's eyes held contempt that no explanation could reach. His son saw only that other men were going while his father stayed. That courage apparently required repeated demonstrations, and William had failed the test. William wanted to grab John and shake him, force him to understand what war actually was versus what children imagined it to be. Instead, he spoke with a control that cost everything he had. "There is no honor in war, only survival. I survived once so you wouldn't have to go. I'm staying now, so you'll still have a father when you're old enough for them to take you." John's expression didn't soften. "You're afraid. That's all this is. Fear pretending to be wisdom." The boy walked away and William let him go, too tired to chase, too damaged to explain further. Somewhere in France, Blackwood was probably making marks on his lists, calculating which new soldiers would survive and which wouldn't, perpetuating the machine that consumed men and produced nothing except survivors too broken to appreciate survival. Winter came hard, temperatures plunging, snow arriving early and heavy. The rebuilt house held heat poorly, gaps in the construction that hadn't been properly sealed because time and resources had run short. They burned through firewood faster than sustainable, each log consumed, moving them closer to freezing in spring when supplies ran out. Mary developed a cough that sounded wrong, wet and rattling, the same sound Sarah had made months earlier. William watched his 5-year-old struggle to breathe and saw Thomas dying of dysentery, saw the French knight drowning in his own blood, saw all the ways bodies failed when circumstances became unendurable. Emma applied remedies that might help or might do nothing, crushed herbs in hot water, wool strips soaked in oils, prayers to saints who remained conspicuously silent. The cough worsened despite interventions. Mary's fever climbed, her small body burning with heat that served no purpose except to exhaust her further. William sat by her bedside during nights when sleep was impossible anyway, listening to her labored breathing, helpless against this enemy that couldn't be fought with billhooks or courage. Emma worked herself into exhaustion, caring for Mary while managing the household's other impossible demands. William tried to help, but his help was limited by the same unreliability that had plagued him since returning. He'd be doing something useful, and then his mind would fracture, depositing him in France, where usefulness meant killing efficiently and surviving another hour. On the worst night, when Mary's breathing became so labored that each inhale was a desperate rattle, Emma finally broke. Her control shattered and she collapsed against William. sobbing with the exhaustion of someone who'd been holding everything together through will alone and had no will remaining. I can't lose her. I can't. I've lost everything else, but I can't lose her. William held his wife while she cried, offering the only support he was capable of providing, which was presence. He couldn't promise Mary would survive because promises had proven meaningless. He couldn't offer assurance because assurance was dishonesty. All he could do was bear witness to Emma's pain and hope that shared suffering was marginally better than suffering alone. Mary survived the night and the next. Her fever broke on the third day, the crisis passing as mysteriously as it had arrived. She woke weak but clear-eyed, asking for water in a voice that sounded like hers again. Emma fed her broth made from the last preserved vegetables, portions that should have been saved but necessity demanded expenditure. The relief William felt was so intense it approached pain, a reminder that he could still feel something beyond numbness, that his capacity for emotion hadn't been completely burned away by French fields. Mary was alive. His daughter would survive this particular threat, though others waited in infinite succession. December brought a visitor William hadn't expected and wasn't prepared to receive. A young man, well-dressed in clothes that marked him as servant to nobility, arrived asking for William by name. The man carried a sealed letter and a package wrapped in fine cloth, both bearing markings William couldn't read. The letter was in French initially, but the servant provided translation, reading aloud in accented English, that transformed foreign words into devastating meaning. The letter came from a Count Jean-Baptiste de Montfort, father to the young knight William had given water to at Crécy. The knight's name had been Jean, 19 years old, the Count's youngest son and last remaining heir. Before dying, Jean had told his squire about the English soldier who'd shown him mercy, who'd given water and stayed with him while he died alone on a foreign field. The Count had spent months tracking down this soldier through military records and scout reports, piecing together enough information to locate William's village. The letter continued with words that struck William like renewed wounds. The Count wanted to thank the man who'd shown his son humanity in his final moments. The package contained payment, the Count's gratitude made tangible, an amount that seemed obscene for the simple act of giving water to a dying boy. The servant placed the package in William's hands and departed before William could formulate response. He stood holding it, staring at the fine cloth wrapping, unable to process what had just occurred. Emma appeared beside him, drawn by the commotion. She looked at the package, at William's stricken expression, at the space where the servant had been. "What is it?" William's voice came out hollow. "The French knight I gave water to, the one who died. His father tracked me down. This is payment for showing his son mercy." Emma's eyes widened, but she recovered quickly, pragmatism overriding shock. "Open it." The package contained gold coins, more than the Crécy plunder. More than William had imagined accumulating across a lifetime of farming. Enough to rebuild completely, enough to replant properly, enough to hire labor and purchase livestock and create the kind of security that had been fantasy rather than goal. It also contained a personal note from the Count, shorter than the formal letter, written in careful English. "You gave my son peace when peace was impossible. You stayed with him so he didn't die alone among enemies. This is insufficient payment for such kindness, but it's all I can offer. Thank you for seeing my Jean as human when humanity had fled the field." William read the note 3 times, each reading making breathing harder. He'd thought of giving Jean water as a moment of weakness, a failure to maintain the hardness Blackwood had insisted was necessary for survival. But Jean's father saw it differently, saw it as the one purely good thing William had done during the entire nightmare of war. Emma's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "This changes everything. This means we're secure. The children can eat properly. We can hire help for planting. We can save something." She was right, but William couldn't feel relief, only the crushing weight of understanding that his one decent act had purchased their salvation. He'd killed Jean's older brother probably, or someone like Jean, in the chaos of battle. He'd stripped corpses and taken rings from dead fingers. But the act that earned reward was the single moment of mercy in a landscape of atrocity. Emma gripped his arm, her voice fierce. "You earned this. Whatever else you did, you earned this. Accept it." William wanted to believe her, but belief required moving past guilt that had calcified into identity. He'd become a person who killed, who survived while others died, who came home damaged and distant. The money from Jean's father couldn't change any of that. It could only complicate his relationship with actions whose morality remained murky. The gold was used as Emma insisted. They hired labor for spring planting, purchased proper seed rather than using saved grain, bought a plow horse to replace the one that had died while William was gone. The investments were practical and necessary and felt like building on a foundation of corpses, using dead men's money to construct living men's futures. Spring came eventually, winter releasing its grip with the grudging slowness of a predator full, but not satisfied. William worked the fields with the help they'd hired, trying to rebuild routines that had sustained him before war, finding them impossible to recreate. The rhythms were the same, but he'd changed too fundamentally to fit back into patterns designed for the person he'd been. John worked beside him, the boy's anger having cooled into something harder and more permanent. Not rage, but dismissal, a writing off of his father as someone whose weakness had been demonstrated and whose opinion therefore didn't matter. William tried multiple times to bridge the gap, to explain, to reconnect, but John evaded each attempt with the skill of someone who'd learned that emotional safety required distance. One evening, William found John behind the barn, practicing with a stick shaped like a sword, executing movements that looked disturbingly competent for a 9-year-old who'd never received training. The boy was preparing himself for war, teaching himself basics through observation and imagination, becoming the warrior he thought men were supposed to be. William's voice came out rougher than intended. "What are you doing?" John didn't stop practicing. "Learning to fight. Since you won't teach me, I'll teach myself." The words were accusation and plan combined. William wanted to forbid this, to insist that John never learn warfare's reality, but forbidding felt like the cowardice John had already accused him of. Instead, he heard himself say something unexpected. "I'll teach you, not because war is honorable, because knowing how to survive is better than dying, because you didn't know." John paused mid-swing, searching his father's face for deception or weakness. Finding neither, he nodded once, sharp and controlled. "Teach me then." The lessons began the next day, and they were nothing like the fantasies John had constructed. William taught him how to hold a blade so it wouldn't be knocked away, how to maintain balance when someone larger pushed you, how to target joints and gaps rather than armored surfaces, how to stay alive by being smart rather than brave, because bravery was stupidity wearing a more appealing name. Between lessons, William told stories that stripped war of glory. He described Thomas dying of disease without ever seeing battle, Edmund crushed under horses, the young knight he'd killed who'd looked surprised as he died, the compression at Crécy where men suffocated standing up, the aftermath where survivors looted corpses and left the dead naked for scavengers. John listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from eagerness to something more complicated as reality replaced fantasy. By the third week of lessons, his enthusiasm had tempered into something closer to understanding. War was an adventure. It was a nightmare where the only victory was not dying immediately. After one particularly brutal lesson, where William demonstrated what happened when amateurs fought professionals, John's voice emerged small and uncertain. "You went to war to save me, didn't you?" William stopped cleaning the practice weapons, meeting his son's eyes directly. "Yes, the bailiff would have taken you instead. You were tall enough, strong enough. They'd have put you in the front rank at Crécy. You'd have died in the first minutes." John processed this, his face working through emotions he didn't have words for yet. "So you went and you thought you'd die so I wouldn't have to." William nodded, unable to trust speech. John's next words came slowly, carefully chosen. "I called you a coward. I was wrong. I'm sorry." The apology cracked something in William that had been frozen since homecoming. Not healing, not quite, but the first indication that healing might eventually be possible. He pulled John into an embrace that the boy accepted, the two of them standing behind the barn while the sun set, father and son beginning the long process of reconstructing what war had damaged. Emma noticed the shift and said nothing, wise enough to recognize that some repairs required time and silence rather than intervention. But William caught her watching them work together, saw something like relief in her expression, a small victory claimed against the campaign of losses they'd been fighting. Summer arrived, and with it, news of the war's progression. King Edward's forces had advanced. Calais had fallen after lengthy siege. English territory in France had expanded significantly. The campaign William had helped begin continued grinding forward, consuming soldiers and producing the kind of victories that meant something to nobles and nothing to the people who paid for them in blood. More veterans returned, fewer than had left, all of them marked by their service in ways visible and hidden. The village accumulated a population of damaged men who couldn't quite fit back into civilian life, but had nowhere else to go. They formed an informal community of the broken, gathering at the tavern or in fields, sharing silence and occasional stories that never fully captured truth. Harold, the one-armed blacksmith, approached William one evening with a proposition. Several veterans were discussing pooling resources, purchasing land together, creating a place where they could work and live among people who understood what they carried. A community of survivors who wouldn't have to explain or hide or pretend wholeness they'd never reclaim. The idea held appeal, but also felt like surrender, like admitting he'd never fully returned to normal life. William thanked Harold and said he'd consider it, then did nothing because making decisions required clarity he didn't possess. Marjorie appeared in late summer, part of a group of camp followers who'd attached themselves to veterans returning home. She looked older than William remembered, the months since Crécy having etched new lines in her face. But her eyes still held the same pragmatic kindness. The recognition that survival required mutual support and judgment was luxury. She set up at the tavern, providing the same services she'd offered at camp, though fewer soldiers could afford her now. William encountered her one evening and they sat together, not speaking at first, just existing in proximity the way they had during the campaign when words felt insufficient. Marjorie's voice eventually emerged, soft and observational. "You made it home, found your family alive. That's more than most of us got." William nodded, unable to articulate why finding his family alive hadn't resolved anything, why their survival felt like opening a new battle rather than concluding the previous one. Marjorie continued, her tone suggesting she understood without him explaining. "Coming home is harder than leaving. At least when you leave, you know what you're going toward. Coming back, you don't know what you've become or whether there's space for that person anymore." The accuracy of that assessment was painful. William had spent months trying to fit back into William-shaped spaces, finding that his shape had changed in ways that made fitting impossible. He was too large for some spaces, too small for others, fundamentally incompatible with the life he'd left behind. Marjorie offered her own truth. "I've been following armies 20 years. I've seen hundreds of men go home and then come back to the army because home didn't fit anymore. They couldn't explain what they carried, couldn't stop jumping at loud noises, couldn't pretend to care about things that mattered to people who hadn't seen what they'd seen. So they came back where at least the brokenness was normal." William asked if she thought he'd end up doing that, returning to war because peace was unendurable. Marjorie's response was careful. "I think you have more holding you here than most. Wife who understands killing. Children who need their father. Enough money to make staying possible. But I also think part of you is still at Crécy, still sitting with that French boy, still trying to make sense of why you survived, and he didn't." The observation cut close enough to truth that William couldn't argue. He'd left part of himself on French fields and wasn't sure he wanted it back. That part understood violence, processed trauma, functioned in contexts where functioning meant the difference between living and dying. Home didn't need that part, but without it, he felt incomplete, operating at partial capacity. They sat until the tavern closed. Then Marjorie stood and touched his shoulder with the gentle firmness of someone who'd tended countless wounded. "You'll figure it out, or you won't. Either way, you'll survive because that's what you do." She walked away and William remained, staring at stars that looked the same as French stars, but felt different because England wasn't France, and home wasn't war, even though his mind couldn't consistently distinguish between them. Autumn approached, and with it came an unexpected visitor. a monk traveling through the region, collecting stories from veterans for a chronicle being compiled by his monastery. The monk sought William specifically, having heard somehow about the English soldier who'd shown mercy to a dying French knight at Crécy. William refused the interview initially, having no interest in his story being preserved or transformed into something edifying. But the monk persisted, explaining that chronicles preserve truth against the distortions of time, that future generations deserve to understand war's reality rather than its mythology. Eventually, William relented, sitting with the monk in the rebuilt house while Emma listened from her corner. He told the story not as heroism, but as it had happened. The chaos, the fear, the moment of giving water because ignoring a dying boy's plea felt like crossing a line he wasn't ready to cross. The watching Jean die because leaving seemed worse than staying. The guilt when he'd looted the body later because survival required taking from the dead. The monk listened without judgment, making notes in Latin that William couldn't read. When the story finished, the monk's response was thoughtful. Most stories I hear are about violence and survival. Yours is one of the few that's about humanity persisting where humanity shouldn't have been possible. That's worth preserving. William wasn't sure he agreed but didn't argue. If his story helped someone understand war's reality, perhaps it served purpose beyond the personal. Though he suspected the chronicle would edit out the looting and the guilt and the nightmares, leaving only the moment of mercy and transforming complexity into simplicity that served narrative rather than truth. The monk departed and William never learned whether his story made it into the chronicle or how it was presented. It didn't matter. The monk's visit had forced him to verbalize experiences he'd been carrying silently, to frame them in language that made them slightly more manageable. Not resolved, just contained. Winter's second approach brought different preparation than the previous year. They had resources now, food stored properly, firewood purchased in quantity, the house sealed against wind. Basic security that last year had seemed impossible was now simply logistics. The change was Jean's father's gold, dead knight's wealth transformed into living family survival. William stood at the edge of his fields as the first snow fell, watching white accumulate on earth he'd planted and tended and would harvest again come spring. The cycle of seasons continued regardless of whether he felt part of them. Survival was happening despite his damage, the world accommodating his brokenness because it had to, because there was no other option. Emma joined him, wrapping her cloak tight against wind that cut through clothing designed for work rather than standing. Her hand found his and they stood together, two damaged people who'd chosen each other before damage and were choosing each other again after, trying to construct something functional from the pieces they'd become. Emma's voice emerged quiet against the wind. "We're going to be fine, not perfect, but fine. That's enough." William wanted to believe her and found he almost could. Fine wasn't the life they'd planned before war interrupted planning, but fine was better than the alternatives he'd witnessed, better than dying in France or coming home to graves. Fine meant his children would eat and grow. Emma would smile occasionally. He'd still have nightmares, but nights between them might lengthen. That night, the nightmare was different. William dreamed he was back at Crécy, but this time Jean didn't die. The water William gave him was somehow enough. The young knight survived, stood up, walked off the battlefield beside William. They returned to their respective homes as survivors rather than victim and killer. The dream was impossible, but felt more real than most of his waking hours. A vision of what mercy could have accomplished if mercy had possessed the power people pretended it had. He woke with tears on his face and Emma's arms around him, her body warm against his, her voice murmuring reassurance that penetrated fog enough to bring him back to Yorkshire, to the rebuilt house, to the life he was slowly learning to inhabit again. The years would pass and William would survive them, though survival looked different than he'd imagined. The nightmares never fully stopped, but their frequency decreased. His relationships with his children would rebuild in forms adapted to who they'd all become. Emma would remain his anchor, the one person who understood what carrying death felt like, because she'd carried it too. John would grow tall and strong, and when the next call for soldiers came years later, William would use the last of Jean's gold to purchase his son's exemption, breaking the cycle that had consumed so many families. John would be angry about it, feeling denied something he thought he wanted. But William would accept that anger knowing it was infinitely preferable to grief. Mary would survive childhood illnesses that claimed other village children, her constitution strengthened by whatever had allowed her to survive that terrible winter night. Sarah would grow without memory of the raids or the fear, her childhood shaped by the security Jean's gold had purchased, rather than the poverty that had defined William's youth. And William himself would learn to live with contradiction. He was farmer and killer, survivor and victim, destroyer and protector. The man who'd take a ring from a dead knight's finger, and the man who'd give water to a dying boy. All of it was true, none of it was complete. He contained multitudes that didn't resolve into coherent narrative, fragments of identity that coexisted without reconciling. On certain evenings, he'd sit by the fire holding Thomas's iron ring and Jean's medallion, physical reminders that he'd witnessed deaths he couldn't prevent and shown mercy where mercy was optional. The objects were weights he carried not as penance but as proof. Proof that he'd been there. Proof that it had mattered. Proof that somewhere between survival and morality, in spaces where those concepts overlapped, he'd made choices that defined who he'd become. The village would slowly forget that William had been at Crécy, his participation fading into background of community memory, where wars were dates and outcomes rather than individual experiences. But William wouldn't forget, couldn't forget. His memories would remain vivid, precise, immune to the softening time usually provided. He'd grow old carrying France inside him, the weight never lightening, but becoming familiar enough to bear. His grandchildren would ask about the scars visible on his arms, and he'd tell them stories about farming accidents, protecting them from truths they didn't need to carry. Emma would know the real stories and would lie beside him in the darkness when nightmares came. Her presence the only thing that could pull him back from fields where the dead still waited. The last thing William would think before he died, decades after Crécy, would be Jean's face as the light left his eyes. Not in nightmare this time, but in something closer to peace. He'd given water to a dying boy on a battlefield where humanity shouldn't have existed. That single act of mercy had purchased his family's survival through Jean's father's gratitude. The mathematics of that exchange remained incomprehensible, but William had stopped trying to understand and accepted simply that it was true. War had taken much from him, but mercy had returned something. Not redemption, which was too clean a word for the complexity he carried, but maybe grace, the undeserved gift that had allowed him to protect the people he loved by being slightly more human than circumstances required. The snow continued falling outside, accumulating on fields that would be planted again come spring, covering the earth with white that made everything look clean, despite the dirt beneath. William stood at the window watching it fall, Emma beside him, their children safe inside the house that had been rebuilt from ashes, and allowed himself the smallest measure of something almost like contentment. He'd survived war. He'd survived homecoming. He'd survived the slow violence of trying to rebuild life from fragments. Survival wasn't victory, but it was something. And in a world where most soldiers never came home at all, something was everything they could reasonably claim.